Whatever. This went around already? Everybody signed up? Did you give me your bank account information also? Sorry. It's okay, I'm joking. Kind of. Anyway, I so apologize for being late. Wasn't my fault. I was at the airport way on time, and they had even started the boarding, and then stopped the boarding, got everyone off the plane because they had discovered a technical failure on the plane, and it ended up taking off 2.5 hours late and landing 2 hours late. And then, of course, my luggage was the very last item on the carousel, the last one. But you know what it is? When the things that are totally beyond your control, I've learned this. I didn't used to be like this. I used to be, oh no, oh no, oh no. And it is what it is. God's in charge, and we're just going to roll with the picture show, right? So here I am, and I really appreciate that you didn't go run off. I'm sure you all have better things to do today. But it's amazing that you just hung around. So thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I understand there's been all kinds of introductions and things, and Phil and Brenda, who you've met, are wonderful, wonderful volunteer representatives here in the UK. And it's actually I'm sure very comfortable for them to be here, because usually they're carting me all around England, and here they're in Wales. So, but I understand you're not all Welsh. A lot of you are not Welsh. Is that okay, Phil? Do you root for the same football team? No, I know. Okay, I'm not going to tread on any more sensitive things. Oh, I don't need the glass. Thank you, Brenda. You're wonderful. Those of you who know me know that my veins flow with this stuff. I haven't had one since I left Israel. No, I had one on the plane at the beginning of the flight. Anyway. Good. Okay. Now, where are we starting? So, first of all, my name is Sondra Baras. I think you know that already. And what I want to do today, first of all, is tell you about what I am most passionate about, and that is the land of Israel. I grew up in the United States of America. I'm an Orthodox Jew and always was, and that means that I started studying the Bible at a very young age. And I'm going to read you a little bit from Genesis 12. I have a feeling you guys know your Bible, right? Just have that sense. Okay, so I'm going to read for you from Genesis 12, but I have to tell you, when I first read Genesis 12, okay? Read it, not hear the stories like when you're in preschool and before you knew how to read, you hear the stories. But when I first actually was able to read it in the Bible, I was probably in the second grade. We first learned our letters and how to read a bit in Hebrew when we were in kindergarten. And then in first grade, we learned to read the Bible, but we were slowly going in those years. So I think we only did like the first 3 or 4 chapters. It took a while. But by second grade, we were zooming away. And that was when I first learned, studied, read Genesis 12, which of course begins, in a way, really begins the story of the Jewish people. Because the first 11 chapters of Genesis are universal chapters. It is about God creating the world and all the various families that grow into nations. And then something very unique happens at the beginning of Genesis 12. The Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country, from your birthplace, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will raise up your name, and you will be for a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you, and through you will be blessed all the families of the earth." At this moment in history, God takes a right turn. And instead of just discussing humanity, he takes one person out of that humanity, and he gives him a very different job and a very different destiny. And he calls Abraham out of the multitude, and he says, you are going to become a nation, a great nation. And you will be pulled out. He's telling him now, leave the place you're familiar with. Leave your father. And he leaves his father behind. In fact, his nephew Lot goes with him at this point, but he will be separated from him also later on. In fact, the whole story of Genesis, if you think about it, is a story of separation. God continues to refine his choice as he chooses Abraham, and then he chooses Isaac, and then he chooses Jacob. And it's only when we get to Jacob's children that there is no further weeding out. But that becomes, of course, the children of Israel. But at this point in time, we get what the first, that selection begins. And then, of course, Abraham obeys God. He goes to the land. And notice he doesn't even know yet where he's supposed to go. God says, I will go to the land that I will show you. Verse 6, Abram passed through the land. At the end of verse 5, he came to the land of Canaan. Verse 6, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanite is then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram, saying, I will give this land to your children. And he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now, this is, again, a very critical moment in time. How many of you have been to the area of Shechem, to Elon Moreh, the oak of Moreh, Mount Gerizim, other than Mike and Brenda and Phil? A couple of you. Okay, I want to invite you. I understand there's a group of you going to Israel in September. I personally invite you to join me there, okay? There's an amazing lookout point called the 3 Seas Outlook, which I invite you to be my guest there, and I will show you. I'm going to teach you a bit of it here, but I'm going to reserve part of that teaching for when you get there, because there is no way you can really appreciate the message that I'm going to convey today as much as you will understand that message when you're there. But we're going to make do with second best here in Wales, okay? Anyway, he's there at the oak of Moreh, and it is there that God appears to him and says, I will give this land to your children. And this is a very critical moment in time, because it is here for the first time that we have the God of Israel promising the land of Israel to what will become the people of Israel. And the entire Bible now takes off from this point. Everything before is nice and interesting background fluff. Here is where the real stuff begins. Okay? It's important. No, it is important to know. In fact, it's very interesting. There's a very famous commentator named Rashi. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. And he asks a question at the very beginning of Genesis. He asks a slightly different question. His question is, why is it that the Bible begins with Genesis? Why doesn't it begin with Exodus chapter 14? Why? Because or is it 12? Whatever. What's his point? His question is, why do we need the stories? Why don't we just have a book of laws? A book of laws. And then the first laws that were given to the nation of Israel was the Passover laws. That's in Exodus, Exodus 12, I think. Exodus 12. Just before they're about to leave, and they're told about how to bring the Passover sacrifice and all these other things. He says it should start there. But I think his question and his answer is just as relevant also to why does this start in Genesis 1 and why doesn't it start in Genesis 12? And then it continues. And I'll tell you his answer. His answer is so amazing because it is so unbelievably relevant today, okay? His answer is as follows. Because God needs to tell us that he created the world. Because if that creates his authority, God created the world. He divided up the earth to who he pleased. And if at some point he decided to take something from that earth that he had initially given to one nation and then give it to another nation instead. In other words, if at some point, and we learned in the first 11 chapters, not only that God creates the world, but we have the nations. We have the sons of Noah. We have Canaan, right? We know the land that Canaan gets, right? And then we have Abraham coming on the land, being promised the very same land. So what does Rashi says? He says, when the nations will come and say to him, this is, Rashi lived 1,000 years ago. When the nations will come to you, Israel, and say, robbers and thieves, you have occupied somebody else's land. Isn't that amazing? What are you going to say to them? You're going to say, God created this earth. He can give it to who he pleases. He initially gave it to Canaan, and now he's giving it to Israel. An amazing thing because, wow, it's like, one of the things I find so amazing about that answer is, let's be frank, okay? Rashi lived in France in the Middle Ages, about 1,000 years ago, okay? He lived in France, and he lived in a Christian Europe. He actually lived he was like, at a time, he had good relations with his neighbors in France, but he had also had to leave Germany because of persecution. So he knew Christian anti-Semitism in Europe, and of course things got even worse after that and whatever. But I can't imagine that Rashi really believed that if his neighbors, the Christian anti-Semites, were to come to him and said, you have no business in Israel, or that's not your land, and he would have said, well, God said so, do you think they would have paid attention? Do you think they would have listened? I don't think so. Well, maybe some of them would have, because some of them were real, believing people, read the Bible, whatever. But don't forget, in those years, the prevailing theology in Christianity was replacement theology, which means if you would say to a Christian those years, it says in the Bible, God promised it to Israel, their answer would have been, oh, no, that promise is finished. Right? That promise is finished. Cross out the word Israel, replace it with church. Now, let's fast forward to where we are today. Who are our primary problems? Is it people who read the Bible? Not really. I come into a community like this and I say, God created the world. He gave the land to Israel. It says in Genesis 12, and you're going to say, amen. I don't have to argue with you, which is one of the reasons I love speaking to Christian groups, because I don't have to argue. I don't mind arguing, but I don't like arguing, I trained as a lawyer, so I know how to argue. But one of the reasons I do what I do now instead of being a lawyer is because I don't like to argue. Anyway, but today, who are the people saying, you're thieves, you've stolen the land that isn't yours? The Muslims. Some of the church. In England, some of the church in particular. Okay, but our biggest problem is Muslims. So if you go to the Muslims and you pull out your Genesis 12 and you say, says here, what are they going to say? Bible's a forgery, right? That's what they believe. They believe that their Quran is the original Bible, and what we have is a forgery, right? So is this going to make a difference to them? Who is this going to make a difference to? Only people like you. Only people like you. Only Christians, not the Christians in the Anglican Church and wherever they are that don't really go for this way of thinking, but your kind of Christians. People who read the Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, and say, yes, God meant what he said. And so I find this very, very interesting because I do believe in a way that God, if we take Rashi's perspective, which I think is a very brilliant one, and if I'm saying that God wrote these chapters so that we would understand God's authority and therefore accept the way he divided the earth, right? The premise there is that there are going to be groups of non-Jews who will accept a biblical argument, which means he's aiming at you and people like you. And there's a growing number of you today around the world. It's amazing. So that's just an aside. That really wasn't what I came to talk about, but but it's a nice aside. Anyway, the point of this, though, is that it's there that God promised the land to the Jewish people, to Abraham for his people. And you all got these brochures, right? So if you open this one, you'll have a map. Did you go through the map at all? You did. So I don't have to do that anymore? Briefly. Okay. Just to give you background of what it is we're talking about. This is the center of the land of Israel today, the state of Israel. The Galilee is off the map in the north, and the Negev is off the map in the south. And you can see here we have Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Mediterranean, the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is here along the edge of the map. It's not shown. And the Sea of Galilee is about here, okay? This is the place where Abraham stood. You see Shechem? Okay. Go to the east of Shechem, and you'll see a Jewish community called Elon Moreh. That's the original Hebrew for the Oak of Moreh. It's there that Abraham stood, and it's there he received the promise. He then starts walking south, and he builds his next altar in Bethel, which is noted on this map as Beit El. If you look at Ramallah, which is here, okay, just a little bit above that, you see another Jewish community called Beit El. That's Hebrew for Bethel. And that's where Abraham builds his second altar. And then when he comes down, continues south, he ends up in Hebron. Okay? Over here is Hebron. And it is in Hebron that he makes the first purchase of real estate when he buys the cave in the surrounding field to bury his wife Sarah. This road that he goes down from Shechem down to Hebron, and the road actually continues down to Beersheba, this is today Route 60. It's a regular, modern road that we travel up and down, and there are a lot of Jewish communities along this road and off of it. Just a brief understanding of what all the different colors are on this map will give you a sense of where we are today, and then I'm going to go backwards again in history. You see brown and yellow, and then the background color, okay? Now, brown is area A, yellow is area B, and the background color is area C. What does all this mean? Okay, we're going to get to what it means now. I'm going to go backwards a little bit, okay? Just keep in mind, the brown is area A, the yellow is area B, and the background color is area C. Now I want to tell you a history of the settlement movement, okay? What I think we saw is that God made it very clear that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, and we see that promise repeated over and over again. And the promise was actually made where? In Samaria, right near Shechem. And if we look at where the forefathers were, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their families, where they lived, where they most of their activities were, it was in Judea and Samaria. That road that we followed, Route 60, from Shechem to Bethel to Hebron, that goes right through, cuts through. It's a road that goes along the mountain ridge that cuts right down through Judea and Samaria, from Samaria down to Judea. And if we pay attention to the Hebrew scriptures, both Genesis, where we have the story of the forefathers, and then afterwards, when the nation of Israel enters the land, beginning with Joshua and going through that whole period until the end of 2 Kings, when the temple is destroyed and they're exiled to Babylon, through that whole period of time, most of the activities in the center of Jewish, the population, the Jewish activity, political activity, religious activity, is in Judea and Samaria. If you pay attention to the various places. And what's really neat is that today, some of the modern Jewish communities are set in places with the same biblical names, because it's in the same places that were then very unique places. So if we talk about Hebron, we talk about Shiloh, which is a modern Jewish community. There's a community called Tekoa. I don't know if you remember that one, but that's where Amos is from, okay? And Amos is wonderful, because the last verse of Amos, you will then be planted on your land, never again to be uprooted. I mean, what an amazing statement of Amos. And where is he from? Tekoa. And it's so symbolic, I think, that today we have a modern community of Tekoa that is just going by leaps and bounds. So this is the connection. This is past and this is present. But what I want to fill you in now is how we got there. How do we get there in our modern times, okay? So first of all, it's very important to understand the Jewish people were exiled from Israel twice, okay? Once you read about in the Bible with the exile to Babylon, and then the return. And we read about the return in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the later prophets, Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, are from that period of time. Okay? But then they're exiled again. That exile was short. It was only 70 years, and they only went to Babylon. They were exiled again when the Romans destroyed the temple almost 2,000 years ago, in the year 70. Okay? And then the Jews were dispersed all over. Now, there's a promise that God makes. He makes it in a few different places, but I want to refer to one place in particular, and that's in Deuteronomy 30, one of my favorite chapters. And here, this is kind of an addendum to this covenant that we call the blessings and the curses. The nation comes and stands when they come into the land of Israel. They stand at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. I'm going to put that all together for you, but the connection between Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, and the Oak of Moreh. If you want to know what the connection is, visit me in September. There. I have that's waiting. I'm not going to tell that to you today. But today, I'll just talk about this covenant at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And one of the first things they do when they enter the land under Joshua, and it's the first time that there's a covenant between the nation of Israel and the God of Israel in the land of Israel, because the previous covenants with the nation were all in the desert. And the covenant is the blessings and the curses. If you do good, all these blessings. If you do bad, all these curses. And the curses far outweigh the blessings. Okay? And the final curse is exile and dispersion. So Deuteronomy 30 comes as addendum to that. And it says, after all these things will happen, the blessings and the curses. This chapter begins from the presumption that the curses have taken place and the nation is indeed exiled all over the world. And what happens? Okay? You will let's read from verse 3. The Lord your God will restore you. He will take mercy upon you. He will come and gather you from all the nations to which the Lord your God has dispersed you, even if you will be exiled or dispersed to the ends of the earth. From there, the Lord your God will gather you. From there, he will take you, and the Lord your God will bring you to the land that your fathers inherited, and you will inherit it. And you will prosper and multiply more than your fathers. This is the ultimate promise that is said to the nation, that basically says to them, even after you've been exiled, it is not the end of the story. And that promise is what keeps the Jewish people alive. Because all these centuries, and I said this last exile, almost 2,000 years, all these centuries, Jews hold on to that promise. And of course, this promise is repeated by the prophets. And but it's a promise that Jews take seriously, and prayers that were written then after the Romans exiled us, we still say today. The same text, the same prayers. And what are those prayers full of? Asking God to return us to, there's prayers, of course, about health and prosperity and all these peace and all that stuff. But there's also a very important part of these prayers is national prayers, where we turn to God and we say, return us to the land of Zion. Bring the Messiah. Bring the redemption. Gather the exiles from the four corners of the earth. Return them to the land of Israel. And these are prayers that are prayed every single day and have been prayed every single day for 2,000 years. Which is, by the way, something else you need to remember when you hear, and especially in Europe, you hear it a lot. Oh, those Jews, they're really Europeans. They don't belong in Israel. They're foreigners. Foreigners? There's a story that's told, I don't know if it's true, but it's a great story. There's a story that's told about Napoleon. Did you ever hear this story? Okay, every summer we fast and pray and mourn on the 9th of Av. It's a date that works out to be somewhere in July or August, depending on the Hebrew calendar. But you all know about the Hebrew calendar. Anyway, and so there's a story that it's a day that you pray, you fast, mourn, and also when you come to the synagogue, we read the book of Lamentations, and the custom is that we sit on the floor, Okay, you don't sit on the chairs. You sit on the floor or on a low stool as a symbol of mourning. You dim the lights. In some congregations, they put some candles or something, so you're reading from like a flashlight or a candle, a very dim kind of thing. And actually, it's very interesting because usually when we read one of the books of the Bible or some chapters of a book of the Bible in the synagogue, we read it from a table in the middle of the synagogue, and there's somebody who gets up there and reads it very loudly for everybody to hear. When it comes to the book of Lamentations, it's read by the people on the floor. In other words, everybody is equal. No one stands up to read it. There's usually each chapter is assigned to somebody else, and they just read it from wherever they're sitting in a very chanting kind of way. Anyway, the story goes that Napoleon, in his conquests of Europe, someplace where there's a Jewish community, was walking by a synagogue. And he hears chanting. He goes to see what's going on. And he sees people sitting on the floor, crying, obviously mourning. He doesn't understand what they're saying, but they're clearly very, very troubled and very sad. And he goes in and he says, "What's the fuss? Who died? Did someone just die? Like, what's it all about?" And the Jews say, no, nobody died. We are mourning the loss of our temple. And he says, really? And when did that happen? And they say, about 1,700 years ago in Jerusalem. And he says as follows. He says, "A nation who knows how to mourn the loss of its temple and its sovereignty and its land will one day again return." That's an amazing statement. But that is the story of the Jewish people. We never let go of this promise that God made to us in Deuteronomy 30 to return to the land. And you have to understand that as the background to Zionism. You have to understand that to the background of everything we see today in Israel. Why did the Jews hold on to this land? Why did, yes, there was anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, but also in the Arab countries. Why is it that we wanted to go back to Israel? Where did we even come up with this idea? Do you realize the miracle of the existence of the nation of Israel is so unbelievable? Even though we're dispersed all over the world, we remain a nation. We don't assimilate. I mean, some people assimilate. There's always people that come and someone told me today, I just discovered my great-grandfather was Jewish. Okay, so that's assimilation, but as a nation, we didn't assimilate. That's amazing. The establishment of the state of Israel, I believe, is the greatest miracle of all time. Because it's a miracle that had to be nurtured for 2,000 years so that the nation of Israel would still exist, so there'd be a nation for God to restore, as he promised he would. And that was the first miracle. As a religious Zionist, we're not just Zionists who happen to be religious. We are Zionists our Zionism is our faith. It's an expression of our belief that what God is doing in the land of Israel is a fulfillment of what he promised, and it is indeed the beginning of the redemption. Now, we both believe in redemption. We're both waiting for Messiah. You think he's somebody else than I do. You think he's been before, and I don't. We don't have to argue over the differences. But we are waiting, okay? And Jews have been waiting for 2,000 years, and for us, the establishment of the state of Israel means we've begun the process of redemption. And you can see it. God says he's going to, what I just read you in Deuteronomy 30, he's going to gather us from all the nations to which we were dispersed, and we see that happening before our eyes. So that's the beginning of the story of modern Israel. And you all know the state of Israel was established in 1948. The British left. Boo. They left. They left a mess. But it's okay. I don't hold it against you, don't worry. The state of Israel is established. People come, Holocaust survivors and refugees from Arab countries and people from England and the United States and Canada and Australia, people who are free and had nothing to run away from, still come to Israel because they want to be part of this amazing miracle of the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. But it's a difficult time. The war ends in 1949. We're attacked on all sides in 1948. The war ends in 1949, and this area that is surrounded by the green line, the same area with the brown and the yellow in the background over here, surrounded by this line, this area ends up being in the hands of Jordan. And it is illegally annexed and occupied by Jordan, and that is a fact under international law, okay? Illegal. And when they talk about an illegal occupation, that's Jordan, not us, okay? And that's without the Bible even. That's on international law. And I know because I'm a lawyer, remember? Anyway, that's this. But you know what? In those days, nobody was even thinking or would have thought about, okay, when we start in the next war. We don't start wars. You know, we have been portrayed as these occupiers, land-hungry, greedy, whatever. All we wanted to do was be left alone and start a state. We didn't get the biblical heartland of Israel, all those places that I showed you, Hebron and Shechem and Bethel and Tekoa. We didn't have those places. Bethlehem, we didn't have. But you know what? We had a state of Israel. Let's be grateful for what we have. And that was the attitude. And then in 1967, 19 years later, Jordan attacked us. As part of the Six-Day War, we were already in war with Syria and Egypt, and they wanted to join the action, and they attacked us. And Israel, amazing. You know, there are two amazing things. The fact that Ben-Gurion made the decision to announce the state of Israel in 1948. There was enormous pressure, both within the Jewish community and all over the world, that said, don't do it. You're going to be massacred. You're provoking the Arabs. Don't do it. What wisdom he had. I don't think it was his wisdom. I think God put this, this is what you got to do. You know, I don't think Ben-Gurion recognizes it was God speaking to him, but no question in my mind. There was this sense of, he made that decision. Somehow, you know, there's philosophers, I have a son who's a philosopher. It can make you crazy. Philosophers ask questions all the time. How do we know what we know, right? Why did I suddenly I'm debating between two things, and then I decided. And I'm confident in my decision. How did that happen? That's what happened with Ben-Gurion. Back and forth. But he made the decision. Somebody gave him peace on that decision. 1967. Why is it that they decided to not just defend the line, but go in and take over Judea and Samaria? Again, it was a back and forth, and someone made that decision. I don't even know who it was. Somebody made that decision. Was it Moshe Dayan? Was it Rabin? I don't know. Someone made that decision. Amazing, okay? So what happened as a result? Judea and Samaria is liberated, and we get to go home. Now, there are people who rejoiced at the victory of the Six-Day War because, indeed, it was an amazing victory. It saved us from slaughter. Before that war, the Jews really were petrified that this was the end of the state. We were outnumbered in every way. So that relief, that amazing, wow, we were averted from disaster, not only just averted disaster, but here we have this amazing extra territory. You can say from a strategic point of view, we are so much better off. We're safer. We have the high ground. We have water. We have defeated our enemies. We drove the Jordanians away. That in itself would be cause for celebration. But there was something far more. And that is that we came back to the biblical heartland, which is good and is important enough, but we came back to the biblical heartland in what was clearly the next step of the redemption. Just 1 month before the Six-Day War began, at a time where no one anticipated the Six-Day War, okay, was Israel Independence Day in 1967. And at that time, there was a yeshiva in Jerusalem called Merkaz Harav. It still exists, and it's been around for a very long time. And the rabbi of that yeshiva, his name was Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook. He was the son of the person who was the first chief rabbi of Israel, who died even before the state of Israel came into existence. He died in 1935. But his son then took over and taught, and he became the visionary, the religious, spiritual leader of what became the settlement movement. But it began before the Six-Day War even began. He had a gathering in his yeshiva, in his Bible study school for young men, and he spoke there on the occasion of Israel Independence Day. And out of the blue, he suddenly turns to his audience and he says, "Where is our Shechem? Where is our Hebron?" As if to say, just because we haven't been able to go into those places for 19 years, don't forget them. They need to still be in our hearts. In a way, it was reminiscent of that ages-old statement that we repeat all the time from the Psalms, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem." In a way, he was saying, well, and also he was talking about Jerusalem. Well, yeah, we have Jerusalem, but we don't have the real Jerusalem at that point. You didn't have the old city, and that's what he was saying. Don't forget Jerusalem, Hebron, and Shechem. And a few weeks later, we suddenly had Hebron, Shechem, and Jerusalem. It's like amazing. Well, this same rabbi then became the leader of the settlement movement, okay? Because what really began the settlement movement was the recognition that it's not just that we're safer now and that we averted disaster, but that God gave us the access that we, almost as if, I feel like what Rabbi Cook said then was kind of prophetic. He didn't understand when he said it that something was about to change. And yet it changed. And it's almost as if maybe either prophetic, or you could say something else. You could say the very act of remembrance is what stimulated God to say, oh, they're ready. They're ready because they're remembering Hebron. You have to yearn for Zion to merit Zion in a way, And so here we had the opportunity, and it was these few people who saw and understood the spiritual significance of all of this that said, you know what? God is giving us this land. That gives us responsibility. We've got to go in. We've got to settle it. And that's how the settlement movement began. Right after the war, already people started settling and went. And the government itself was very, very hesitant and very conflicted. They were holding this land, or at least part of it, for a bargaining chip. If the Arabs would recognize us, if the Arabs would have peace with us, we'll give them some of this land. That was a really bad idea. Let me go on record as saying it's a bad idea. God gives you such an amazing miracle, gives you this land. He doesn't give it to you so you can say, God, thanks so much, but, maybe give it away again. I mean, what kind of appreciation, what kind of a vision is that for what you need to do? So the first people to settle anywhere in Judea and Samaria were the young people from Kfar Etzion. Have you ever been to Kfar Etzion? If you haven't, it's a must. They have a wonderful new museum there now that really tells the story in a very, very moving way. This was a community in Judea that was established in 1943. Many of the people who joined that community in the mid-40s were themselves Holocaust survivors. But they were in an area that was surrounded by Arabs, and it fell the night before Israel became a state. See, that we all learn about the 5 Arab armies that invaded Israel as soon as the British left. But for months before, Arabs, actually Jordanians, coming in undercover, and the local Arabs were laying siege to Jerusalem and to this area, Gush Etzion, and other areas. So this community fell. And a few months before it fell, the children and the mothers were evacuated to Jerusalem, and they survived. But all those who were in the community at the time that the Arabs overran it were murdered by the Arabs. So these people in 1967, the children who had been evacuated, were now young men and women in their 20s. Many of them had just fought in the Six-Day War, and they came to the prime minister and they said, we want to go home, we want to go back and reestablish the community that our parents died fighting for. And it's very interesting because if we talk about remembering, they never forgot. This is a community that every year on the day before Israel Independence Day, which is, by the way, Memorial Day in Israel, that was a special Memorial Day for these people because it was on that day that all these fathers had been killed. And every year they would go to this place on the then Israel side of the border and look across to where Kfar Etzion used to be. The only thing left at that point, because they had had buildings, they had had orchards, and the Arabs had destroyed everything. So the only thing still standing was a very old oak tree, like hundreds of years old. And they could see that oak tree in the distance, and they would say, they would pledge to return, which is an amazing thing. It's like a mirror image, or not a mirror image, it's a replica of the kind of, if I forget the Jerusalem. It's that same idea. So anyway, right after the war, they went to the prime minister and they said, we want to go back, because it was in their heads already. They went back, and that was the first community to be established in Judea after the Six-Day War. And then there were a few other things. Hebron was settled, not without a struggle, but that happened like a year later. And then more or less everybody went to sleep. You had these few interesting areas in Judea. Samaria was empty of Jews. After the Yom Kippur War, which in a way, that was in 1973, served as a sort of a wake-up call, in the summer of 1974, when all the men started coming back from the various posts and the country started to get back on its feet, the settlement movement began in earnest. And at that point, people started saying, we have to settle in Samaria. And they tried 7 times, and each time the government forced them to leave, until December of 1975, when thousands of people joined their effort, and finally the government relented and said, you can settle in an army camp in Kadum, which became the community of Kadumim. Just a year and a half later, Menachem Begin became the first Likud prime minister of Israel, and he changed government policy. It became government policy to settle in Judea and Samaria. What began as a handful, well, there was no one in Judea and Samaria in 1967, a handful even as late as 1975. Today, we have close to 500,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria. It's unbelievable. But it hasn't been easy. You probably know more than I do, because your news is worse than mine. How much opposition we have around the world. And actually, they feed each other. Arab opposition feeds European opposition, which in turn feeds Arab opposition. European opposition takes the form of, saying nasty things, and sometimes academic or economic boycotts, okay? Arab opposition takes the form of terrorism, okay? And this, of course, has been something that we have suffered. Now, every so often, somebody will ask me, why do you do it? Why do you live there? I mean, everything I've just said to you, it's all biblical, it's all ideological, it all makes a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, if you're living in a place that's dangerous, that still requires another question. Why are you there? Like, maybe you should just leave, I have to tell you, I never saw myself as a person who's going to go out and I was never a Rambo. I'm not going to go fight the enemy, just give me a few guns and a grenade in my shoulder. This is so not me. I don't have a gun. I don't know how to shoot. I'm just not that type. But to me, you know what it is? It's just, you come to a place like this because you know it's yours. You come to a place like this because you know you're coming home. You come to a place like this because you really and truly believe that this is what God wants you to do. And we moved to Israel. Why did we move? I mean, that's the first question. Why did we move to Israel from the United States? We had a good life. We always wanted to move to Israel. It was just a question of finishing school, and then we worked a little bit to make a bit of money, and then we moved. But I had a really good job, as did my husband, okay? I had a job in a Wall Street law firm. I don't know if that means anything to you, but that's like up there somewhere, making good money. And then my husband was working, he was in computers, and he was working for McGraw-Hill Publishers, which is also a big company. No, he was working actually for Standard & Poor's at the time. Big company, okay? In a way, we were like it. We had, and we left it after like a year and a half of working, or 2 years of work. I mean, we left without even an ounce of regret. Not anything. It was like, who cares? None of that stuff was important. It was just, let's make a bit of money along the way and then go. And why did I do that? Because to me, God was pulling me to the land of Israel. Anybody, any Jew with a brain, any Jew with a set of eyes that don't have blinders on them, understand that what's going on in the land of Israel is nothing short of miraculous, and Jews need to be there. It's our home. It's where Jewish history is going. You want to, So I'm going to go there, and the fact that it's going to be, and we got there, it was a terrible time economically. It was in the worst of the economic crisis. It was 1984. And I remember how depressing it was for us, because we came, and we came, and we were meeting Israelis who were really depressed, who said, why did you come? I said, what do you mean, why did I come? It was very depressing. These weren't religious people who said it. Religious people said, welcome, But anyway, it was a very difficult time. Things have changed tremendously since then. But, and then right away, within a couple of weeks of landing, literally, we signed a contract to build a house in Samaria, because it was, again, a no-brainer. Oh my gosh, we have the ability to do this. We have the ability to get in the ground floor of a community, not just buy an apartment somewhere where you and 1,000 other families are living in the same place. Big deal, But I felt like if I moved to Israel, then I want where I live to contribute, to mean something. And what better way to do that than to be part of a brand new neighborhood in Samaria? And that was just amazing. So we did that. And we moved in, and we moved in the summer of 1987. It took a while for the house to get built and all this stuff that takes so long. But we moved in the summer of 1987, and that first holiday, the first Feast of Tabernacles, a group of us went on a trip, by cars. We got a tour guide, and we took this driving trip through Samaria. And oh my gosh, where did he take us? In those years, there was no Oslo, there was no brown, yellow, and I still haven't told you what this is because I haven't gotten there yet. There were no places all of it was under Israeli rule, all of it. And also, the Intifada hadn't started yet. There had been a terrorist attack in May of 1987, okay? But and that was it, and that was bad, but it was okay. Things happen. Things happen. So we had this tour, oh my gosh, all over Samaria. I'll never forget it. We went into an Arab village not far from Ramallah, and there was this ancient pool there. And we were staying there at the pool, and you know what the tour guide told us? Do you remember in the rebellion, Abner and Joab, the fight between Saul and David, and there's a point at which those two generals face each other, and what do they say? Let the youths play. I don't know if you remember this, and they slaughter. It's a horrible scene. Okay, because basically they're slaughtering each other, but they say, let the youths play. But they end up, it takes place at a pool. Okay, that was the pool. He said, this is the pool. I mean, can you imagine? Like, there it was, and we were in the middle of an Arab village. Just a few weeks later, there were a bunch of high school kids that went on a school trip with the same tour guide. And I guess he took people to all kinds of crazy places, but it wasn't thought of being so crazy at that point. And he's taking them somewhere on the hills of Samaria, and all of a sudden they're attacked. Okay, and a teenage girl is murdered. This group of kids hiking, on the hills, and she's murdered. Okay, that was terrible. She was from... She was from Elon Moreh. And then a few weeks later, the first Intifada begins, and we see the first time this organized Arab uprising violence, and it suddenly becomes dangerous. Now, they didn't have guns yet. They just had rocks and Molotov cocktails, but it was the first time we saw organized terrorism against us, which meant that every time we left the community, got in the car to drive somewhere, we literally risked our lives because we didn't know what would happen. And I remember at that time I started volunteering to do interviews to the press because everybody wanted to talk to a settler at that point. And I remember that these people would say, but it's just a stone. What's a stone? Because they weren't shooting yet. And I said, a stone kills people. And stones were killing people. And I had a neighbor, a woman who was a number of years older, like she was my mother's age or something, and she was hit in the cheek, and she had to have a metal plate put in there because, they had shattered her cheekbones. And these were things that we were dealing with, and I had babies, and I had children. And then you ask yourselves, at that point you ask yourself, what do I do? Never once did it ever occur to me to leave. How do you leave in a situation like that? That means you giving into these crazies. I couldn't imagine walking away from this national spiritual project that we had just joined. How could we walk away from that? That means letting the bad guys win. We could not do that, and we didn't. And that was the spirit of all of us. And it got more dangerous, and it got scarier. And I remember at one point, years later, when the second Intifada began in the year 2000, and then they had guns. When they started with the stones, then the government of Israel came up with a great idea. They replaced our windows, our car windows, instead of being glass, they replaced it with plastic. So all of a sudden we felt safe again, okay? Because when you throw rocks at a plastic window, nothing happens. I mean, you hear a boom, but nothing happens, right? So we felt safe. And then they have guns, and they started shooting. And then, guns, bullets do go through metal, it goes through plastic, it goes through everything. You weren't safe anymore. And at that point, I remember somebody asking me, how do you live? How do you leave your house every day and go to work? Or how do you take your kids shopping? And I had friends, by the way, who for months did not let their kids leave the community. They didn't I didn't want to do that. I couldn't do that. So they said, how do you do it? And you know what I said? I said, you know what? And it was an amazing, I got to a place somewhere in my own spirit. I got to this place where and I really and truly believe this. And I said, you know what? If that bullet has my name on it, so be it. There's nothing I can do about it. I will just resign myself to whatever God has in store for me, but I'm living my life. And it was a very peaceful, liberating kind of experience. I mean, there's a point at which you say, I don't run things. God gave me a job. That's the job that I need to do. But I don't run the world. I do what I need to do. And you hope and pray that God will look after you. And you know what? He looked after us a lot. Not everybody. I mean, there were people who were killed and hurt. But you know what? I have friends who lost loved ones. I have friends who were seriously injured. I have a neighbor who is in a wheelchair because he was shot as he was driving. He lost his first wife in a terrorist attack. And you should see the optimism, the joy, and he's part of our community. And you know what? You roll over and you move on. That is the only way to do it. Now, I promised to tell you a little bit about what these colors mean. The colors is what really made things very difficult. In 1993, the Oslo process began, and the government of Israel gave pieces of the land of Israel to the Palestinian Authority, which was just then created. The brown, Area A, was given to the full, complete jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. The yellow is Area B, shared jurisdiction between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, where Israel retained security control, but the Palestinian Authority have civilian control. And the background is where all the Jewish communities and the roads leading to the Jewish communities are located, and that remained in full Israel control. And that was the situation for a while, and that brought us right into the Second Intifada. Because as we withdrew our military and our intelligence from those brown and yellow areas, those areas then became centers of terrorism. And they were able to develop terrorist networks unhindered because we were not there. And that's when we started seeing the Second Intifada and the shooting. In fact, we did the stupidity. We gave them guns. Why? This theory was that these PA guys are going to end up using the guns to catch the Hamas. Well, they didn't. They used the guns against us. All that blew up, of course, in 2000 with the Second Intifada, and it took a while, but by 2003, 2004, the IDF regained control, and at that point, everything changed. The IDF was going into the brown areas as well, okay, and the yellow, wherever it needed to find the terrorists and prevent terrorist attacks. In 2005, we had another setback, and that was with Israel withdrawing from the Gaza Strip, and that's what you were talking about, Mike, how terrible that was. 9,000 Jews were forced from their homes in the Gaza Strip. It was a terrible time. Ariel Sharon was, I don't know what his motivation was. He was a hero of the settlement movement and became the greatest betrayer of the settlement movement. And he forced this, first of all, from a political and security point of view, it became a disaster, as you all know. I understand you're all very, very close and supportive of Sderot. What Sderot is suffering today is a direct result of the withdrawal from Gaza. Unfortunately, we've seen that develop. We've seen why. The same thing would happen in Judea and Samaria initially. The places we withdrew from became terrorist centers. We withdrew completely from Gaza. That whole place then ended up in the hands of Hamas, and it's just a mess today, a total mess. And the people suffering, the people in Sderot in that area suffer a great deal. But the people suffering even more are the people who live in Gaza, who have been held hostage by these crazies. And some of them still like the crazies. I mean, I don't even want to go there. It's insane. Thankfully, though, at least in Judea and Samaria, the situation is better. Because what happened was the government basically said, rewrote this map, okay? Not because we signed new agreements, but on facts on the ground, rewrote this map. So that the brown and yellow areas are where the vast majority of the Palestinians live, and those remain under the civilian control of the Palestinian Authority. In other words, they have their own schools, and they have their own, fire departments and whatever. They run their lives, hospitals, etc., health system. It doesn't work very well. There's a tremendous amount of corruption, and again, the Palestinians themselves, for the most part, suffer because of the corruption in their leadership. But everything having to do with security is in the hands of Israel. In the meantime, the Jewish communities have been able to grow and develop, not as quickly and as fast as we would like, not as extensively as we would like, because there's always been international pressure. But one of the things that has changed significantly, and only recently, is that there is a growing movement in Israel that is saying, we want to annex Judea and Samaria. We have left this in-between situation for too long. And the question, of course, is what do you do with the Palestinians? There's a lot of different options. But if we look at the situation that it is today, Israel controls the entire area, but the Palestinians have a sort of autonomy. They can run their own lives so long as they're not involved in terrorism. The Israeli army gets involved to prevent the terrorism, okay? So that's the situation that we have today. It's not ideal. But one of the things that we're, of course, all of us very eager to know what Trump's plan is, because that's involving the whole world. We've had snippets that we've had expressions from the United States saying that they understand that Israel would have legitimacy to hold parts of Judea and Samaria, to annex it. That already is a move in the right direction. Of course, Europe is totally against that perspective. I'm sorry, guys. Your government's not very supportive, but so what? Yeah, but it's not you. It's okay. Anyway. All right. Anyway, bottom line is this. Our movement is a movement that began with a spiritual, biblical vision. Terrorism has not stopped us. Europeans have not stopped us. The Americans have not stopped us. Some of our own leftists have not stopped us. We've had setbacks. We've had challenges. But nothing is going to stop us. And I believe the fact that we have grown all these years is clear evidence that God has blessed our efforts. And what we're all about at Christian Friends of Israeli Communities is enabling you to get involved in this unbelievable activity of settling the biblical heartland. Get alongside us in a project that is clearly the fulfillment of prophecy, and a project that represents the Jewish faith for all these years, that God would indeed hold true to his promises, bring us back to the land. All we needed to do was follow his lead. And when we follow his lead, he blesses us. That doesn't mean it's always easy. It's not. But we're doing it. We're the people who are doing it on the ground. And I'm here to invite you, not only to come and visit with us, and I'll take you to that wonderful outlook, but I'm here to invite you to help us and participate with us in this amazing project that's fulfilling prophecy before our very eyes. Amen. I want to show you a film, short film.